Today on The Big Story, the most basic question that all of us have is, why is it so hot?
Before the Industrial Revolution and large-scale rise of fossil fuel-based manufacturing, our average temperature has now increased 1.1 degrees from that level.
Before we begin, I have to tell you, Prateek, you have to promise me not to make any hot and heat puns.
No.
Which I know is going to be very difficult for you.
This is not how it works on this show. What exactly is a heat wave? Number one. Number two, how is it just different from कि आज गरम दिन है?
There is at least hope that they would care more about climate change as being like a, important mudda, as they say.
Right. So if you ask them, what do you think your constituency is going to look like in 50 years? Sadly, the most common response I get is, it's well beyond my time.
The views expressed in this podcast are the speaker's own. The Quint neither endorses nor is responsible for them. Hello everybody to this new episode of The Big Story. First of all, thanks a lot for your great reception to our previous episode on the Karnataka elections, and it was really encouraging for us because it was the first time our faces were on camera. And if you want us to do more such episodes where हम अपनी अच्छी शक्लें दिखाएं तुम्हें, please let us know, and we'll be doing more of these video episodes for you. But today on our episode, I have a very bad news for you all, that our regular co-host Anjali is not with us today because she has gone for a shoot. So to replace her, वैसे मतलब उसको replace तो कोई नहीं कर सकता, but for this episode,
what an introduction, Prateek! Like such a downer. I'm sorry, the person you like is not here, but here is someone else जिसके साथ काम चला लेंगे.
काम चलना पड़ेगा. No. When it comes to all things health and all, we know the person, we know our go-to person, and that is our member from our Quint Fit team, our health correspondent Anoushka. Hello, welcome to The Big Story.
Hi Prateek, hi everyone. And I'm sorry Anjali is not here. Hopefully I can do justice to your wonderful show. But I am very excited to be on Big Story because I love this podcast. And it's,
yes, and we love you, Anoushka. We love your stories, we love your health coverage and the great stuff you guys are doing with the Fit team.
Yeah, subtle plug for Quint Fit. Please go read our stories and watch our videos.
Okay, Anoushka, so what are we talking about today? And why have we called you here out of all people?
Before we begin, I have to tell you, Prateek, you have to promise me not to make any hot and heat puns.
No.
Which I know is going to be very difficult for you.
This is not how it works on this show. Why do you think I was hired on this show, man? Do you think it was for the research or for my editing skills? No, it was for my hot puns.
Yeah, so leaning into that, we have a hot topic for everyone today.
Yes.
We're going to be talking about heat waves and heat in general. I think we've all been kind of feeling it. So anyone who's listening to it right now probably can hard relate to what we'll be talking about, what we're experiencing. Of course, like a lot of us are very privileged to have, climate controlled environments where we can say it's not the same for everyone.
So where are you right now, Anoushka, and how's the heat over there?
I am in Manesar, and it's actually not that hot today.
Yeah, yesterday.
Because of climate change, we had a very unexpected storm, rain and stuff. But yeah, I mean the daytime right now it is kind of getting hot though. So very unexpected.
I know. I was about to go to office today, but then I was like, not possible, yaar. 9 बजे के बाद निकल ही नहीं सकता मैं घर से बाहर.
Where are you? You're in Noida?
I am in Ghaziabad, close to Noida.
Okay.
So we are going to talk about heat, and more than heat, I think what we want to also talk about is the things that we can do about heat. I mean, of course, as we all know that climate change is happening continuously, and उसकी वजह से ये सारे extreme weather events हो रहे हैं. But is there something we can do to save the most vulnerable populations from this prakop of heat? Because as Anoushka said, that all of us are very, we are not the main victims of this problem, I would say. We have the opportunity to take a day off work. We have all of these amazing ACs and fans at home. But there's such a huge chunk of population which doesn't have that option. So what can they do, and what should we do as a society to sort of help them tackle this problem of heat, right?
Yeah, I mean, more than just helping them, I don't know, that sounds like a very patronizing kind of a stance to take.
Yeah,
it's just
true.
for all of us, right? Like in the last few years, I feel like we've been a lot more aware and a lot more cognizant of the way heat really affects us and how kind of sinister and how silent the effects can be.
Yeah.
To all aspects of our health, like not just in terms of dehydration or health. And in fact, there are a lot of research coming out talking about how heat affects our economy as well, our workforce as well.
Yeah.
And also, in fact, there was this Lancet study recently that was published that showed in 2021 the deaths caused by high temperatures have gone up by 74% since 1980. That's almost twice as much. That's a scary high amount of deaths. I feel like slowly it's creeping into everyone's consciousness that it's not just like hot climate. It's not just part of our, Indian summers, as we call it. It's an actual problem that we need to kind of think about.
Also, what we've been hearing in the past 10 years at least, jitna mujhe yaad hai, news about heat and a particular day being the hottest day in the last 50 years, 100 years, all of that is so rampant that it's almost like we are not surprised anymore. एक टाइम पे ऐसा होता था कि कभी कोई hottest day होता था तो it used to be such a big news और हर जगह आता था, but now it has become so common that every year it's a record breaking day, and especially in a place like Delhi जहाँ पे बहुत गर्मी है clearly. So,
but also, like, I just want to tell all our listeners, the episode is not just going to be us faffing around talking about we can do this and that. We'll have an 100%. Actual expert.
तो फिर 1 घंटे तक रोते ही रहेंगे हम अगर if it's gonna just be us. अरे यार इतनी गर्मी है ये.
Yeah. And when we're talking about climate solution, also heat action plans you're going to hear a lot of heat action plan through the
heat
episode.
Action plans.
But it'll come from someone who actually has some authority in the subject and not just us.
So before we talk about our expert, I just want to talk a bit about these heat action plans, because first of all, I didn't know that something like that existed or needed to be there. मतलब heat is like heat, मतलब गर्मी है.
Exactly, because even any kind of like communication that we get from the government also, or any like authorities, health authorities, it's always very personal about what you can do. Okay, drink water, stay indoors, stay hydrated, have nariyal pani, which is very expensive these days. But I didn't even know that there was any kind of planning at an administrative level for heat waves.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that all of these new kinds of plans have crept up. I mean, we shouldn't have needed a heat action plan.
No, I mean, I feel like we should have had it sooner also.
हाँ, मतलब in the light of events, but I'm saying कि तो ज़रूरत ही नहीं पड़नी चाहिए थी ना, ideally तो heat action plan की.
But वो तो मतलब it has been since the 90s, not even 90s, since the 1900s it's been projected like heat is going to keep increasing, climate change is the thing. So honestly, we should have been prepared and we should have like a better plan, but...
Talking about having it too late, the India ka heat action plan, like the first heat action plan in India came only in the 2013.
Wow, I'm not even surprised.
So it's just a decade old. It's a decade old, that's it. So the concept of heat action plans in India is a decade old, and that happened in Ahmedabad after the 2010 heat wave. Yeah,
in fact, that kind of brings me to urban infrastructure. And when we were kind of talking about this episode, preparing for it, as I'm sure you have as well, I went through a lot of research papers, heat action plans, and somewhere central to all of them is urban infrastructure and the small things that we do in the way we build our homes, in the way we build our cities, constructions that really impact the way we experience heat waves and the magnitude of them that we normally wouldn't even think about, that it could be connected.
So who do we have to enlighten us about heat?
So we have a very special guest.
Who's our hot guest of this episode?
Oh my God, Prateek. I almost thanked the stars that you didn't make a pun, but there it is. So our very special guest is Aditya Pillai. He's a researcher with Center for Policy Research, and he has been working in the field of heat action plans. In fact, he co-authored a report recently, which was published by CPR India as well, on reviewing 37 different heat action plans in Indian cities and towns. So I think it'll be a really interesting conversation to have with him, because he's really gotten deep into it. I just got into all of these nooks and crannies of...
He seems like a heat nerd. He would have like a
Yeah.
perfect idea of it. So I wanted to look at the initial Ahmedabad wala heat action plan, okay, the 2013 wala, because in 2010 there was a heat wave, and after they implemented the 2013 heat action plan, the mortality rate in the 2016 heat wave, which was another very huge heat wave in Ahmedabad, it drastically dropped. So I actually wanted to read the Ahmedabad heat action plan and see कि इसमें ऐसा क्या था.
Okay.
But just the task of trying to get that document was so hard, because it's not like it was there in some government website or something like that. Anyway, government websites, we know how amazingly well maintained they are.
Yeah.
So वो तो नहीं होने वाला था. I had to go to another organization का page where they had critiqued this thing, and it was very बहुत hodgepodge था. And this research, I think, really helps to break down a lot of these documents very cumulatively, and it doesn't single out a single document, and it just talks about a general trend that is being observed.
Yeah. And also, I feel like we should definitely link the report as well, because it's really beautifully done, and it's very comprehensive, has a lot of graphs, interactive graphs, so it's very easy to understand. It's all in one place. So yeah, we should definitely link it as well.
एक बात बताओ मुझे, as a person who researches and does a lot of these health stories, do you like reading research papers, and would you prefer like a research paper which is just text and very very dry, or do you want all of these graphs and ऐसा arrow में कुछ तो drawings वगैरह doodles बनाया हुआ है?
I'm a 5-year-old at heart, so a lot of colors and interactives.
Yeah.
Is, of course. I mean, why would you not want to make your work as accessible as possible, right? Like, if it's easy to digest, easy to understand, it's always better.
This has been my biggest gripe with the research community कि तुम्हारे बहुत I get it that it's a very academic piece of work, but ठीक है, एक स्टार बना दो यार. आई में वो डॉट की जगह हार्ट बना दो. कुछ नहीं करना तो उसी से थोड़ा चटक हो जाएगा.
Yeah, I think that's also why it helps to have guests like Aditya on the show. Not only on the show, but in general, speaking to them directly, because it really helps break that barrier, because how many people really go and read a research paper or a report, right? So having someone just come and explain it to you is always better.
ठीक है, चलो, let us hop into the chat.
Shall we go call him in?
Yes, let's go. Let's have a hot discussion about heat.
Oh my god.
Oh no, hot मैंने बहुत बोल दिया. Let's have
You have a hot cup of tea with you?
No, nothing hot for me today except my looks.
Okay. I'm glad this is an audio podcast.
Hello Aditya, welcome to the big story. Hi, thanks for having this chat with us. How are you?
Hi Prateek, hi Anoushka. Great to be with you today, and excited to chat about climate change and heat waves and all that fun stuff.
Fun stuff, yes, exactly. Where are you right now? How hot is it outside?
So I was in Delhi a couple of days ago, where I think it was approaching 46, 47 degrees. Wow. So pretty nasty. And I guess both of you are currently in Delhi, so you're a better place to talk about the situation in Delhi. But right now I'm in the south, I'm in Karnataka, and it's about, 33 degrees in the night, or it's 31 degrees, and the nighttime low is 25.
Is it like humid heat or like Delhi type heat?
Well, it's 67% humidity, and then it goes up and down. And it's very close to the monsoon, so it's going to.
Do you usually have all of these stats with you on hand? As a researcher, ki hamesha night low, because you were very specific with it. Low, high, humidity, everything is on point.
I keep an eye. I mean, I think one of the byproducts of being in this kind of climate change space is you start looking at these things quite a bit. And unfortunately, I have a watch with a temperature sensor, local temperature sensor. So I'm constantly putting this watch on like various surfaces, trying to get a sense of like what the actual temperature is. So if you put it on a motorbike, for example, you'll get a temperature when it's on the road and running, you get a very different temperature from the IMD temperature gauge. And then you put it in an AC room and you'll see what your body is experiencing, which is very rarely the number on these.
So does the watch have a temperature sensor?
Yeah.
On
it does
as well.
It does, which is why I'm just
So would you say this is like an occupational hazard for you? Because, when we cover a lot of pollution stories, we also tend to be very hyper-focused on what the AQI is at all times. So maybe is this like a result of all the research you've been doing?
Small talk with you must be insane, right? If somebody is in a metro with you and they're like, हाँ यार बहुत गर्मी पड़ रही है, you would be like, yeah man, low itna hai, high itna hai.
Real feel.
The heat index. So it is an occupational hazard, but also it's kind of interesting, even with the AQI stuff, right? So you get a sense of how different people experience this, which I find kind of useful. The only thing is it becomes an obsession after a point. So you're kind of like putting this sensor everywhere, and like it's very rarely on my wrist. It's my watch is on all sorts of random surfaces. It's on the rear view mirror of a motorbike. It's hanging off of, or it's like sitting in the passenger seat of a car, because you can't have it on your wrist because your body temp will corrupt the data. So you have to have it off your wrist.
So does it even tell you your body temperature?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
So it's like an ambient temperature sensor.
Yeah, it's best used that way. Yeah. It's meant for hiking and whatnot. So it's about telling you there's a storm coming, or the temperature is too high to be doing this, that, and the other. And
wow, man, that sounds like a very nice watch. If there are some smartwatch companies willing to sponsor us, we shall tell you what brand this watch is.
Can I say? No, I should say. Until you sign the contract, I should say.
Yeah. Yes. So yes, we were talking about heat waves, and the reason we are talking about heat waves is because it is hot, man. We don't, even though you have the exact numbers, we don't need a very fancy smartwatch to tell us that it is hot. So the most basic question that all of us have is, why is it so hot? And how is it so hot? It's unbearable, right? I mean, Anoushka, you were just telling me about some of the crazy temperatures that were reached. And
yeah, so like you said, the occupational hazard that you have is constantly having to check the temperatures, and covering health, we also tend to have this issue because we've been also writing about heat waves and obsessively looking at temperatures, AQIs, this and that, and we have been talking about heat waves since March, short of February, which is crazy to me. Although I think another testament to the climate change is that the weather drastically changed after that. Also, there was a lot of rains, like untimely rain, sandstorm happening. Like in Noida, it was like an almost apocalyptic situation one day when there was just this crazy sandstorm, plus it was super hot. Even though we talk about heat waves pretty much every year, I feel like in general, in India especially, we don't take heat waves as seriously because we think that heat and heat wave is just part of, the Indian climate, the Indian temperatures. So, but then now people are even more, what do you think? Like, do you think people are talking about heat waves and heat more seriously now, taking it more seriously as a, natural disaster, an issue that needs to be thought of?
The first question is why is it hot is actually not a simple answer. I think it's hot to different degrees for different people, right? It's not the same for everyone. The fact of the matter is, in India, we're in a place that's always been hot. It's just been hot forever because that's the part of the planet the country occupies. But what's happening now, and it's quite clear, and there's enough evidence to support the number of hot days are increasing because of climate change, right? But there's a second side to this, which is also how we've developed our cities and our built environments more generally, towns, and more and more Indian villages, right? So the more you travel through Indian villages, the more you'll see that there's this homogeneity of built structures in the sense that it's all now moving the same direction of cement, multi-storied houses, flat roofs, right? Especially in North India, I think there's like a very strong force of similarity sweeping through most villages in terms of how they're structured. And most of these small hotels and stuff all have the glass facade. Indian village of old is no longer exists. And it's moved it's a replica of the.
It's so interesting that something as basic as what your street is made of or what your building is
Yeah.
made of contributes so much to.
Yeah, hugely. It's this thing that people keep throwing around, the urban heat island effect.
Okay.
Which is basically how your city is structured. It'll concentrate heat, right? So there are all sorts of things that are concentrating heat. The cement is absorbing heat. The glass is reflecting heat, sunlight into the street level. There are all sorts of things going on. There's a lack of shade cover, so you get a lot of heat. And cities, of course, I mean, are much more dense, much larger, much more cement, much more cars, internal combustion engines all over the place, which run very hot. It's coming earlier. That's known to be a climate change, more hot days and more heat waves. And we can get into what a heat wave is, I guess. But
Exactly. That was going to be my next question. That if you want to start thoda basic, say what exactly is a heat wave? Number one. Number two, how is it just different from कि आज गरम दिन है? How is it different from just a hot day, and how is something like a heat wave caused?
great. That is a very important question, because it is all contextual, right? What is a heat wave is contextual. There is no universal standard of this temperature onwards, it is a heat wave. And you would expect that. I mean, you'd think, okay, all human bodies are roughly the same. Why don't you have, we all have the same genetic makeup, roughly the same genetic makeup, whatever. And then you end up with similar responses. But that is not the case because of all these things that we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
There's
like the fever ka temperature is same across the world, like the temperature at which you register a fever. So you would assume that heat waves should.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
But it's not.
Yeah, exactly, right? And all the organs are in the same places. And at the same time, all these things we're talking about, right? The nature of your physical infrastructure, the nature and density of your social infrastructure, the nature of the heat itself, right? Is it humid heat? Is it dry heat? Do you have warm nights? Do you not have warm nights? Are there a lot of people? And then the exposure levels.
Yeah.
These are all things that vary. And so when you declare a heat wave is based on some understanding of all of that. And you have to plug it in. It's very difficult. So because a heat wave is usually declared on a threshold temperature. And the threshold temperature is based on historical data of whether people start dying more at a community level at that temperature. Right.
Okay.
So if you get a difference in temperature, if the temperature goes from say 36 to 37, and you know that there are 1,000 more people dying between these two temperatures, then you should probably set it at 36 or 36.1 or 36.2, depending on where the deaths start spiking.
So you're saying it has more to do with the effect this heat has on people rather than the heat itself. So matlab temperature चाहे कितना भी पहुंच जाए, as long as it only registers as a heat wave as soon as it starts affecting the community at a mass scale.
That's right. So what you're actually testing for when you set a temperature threshold like that is it now exceeding the adaptive capacity of that community? So you're baking in, all the information that people's grandmothers and mothers gave them about how to deal with heat, all this information about their exposure, all this information about the kind of built environment they're in, the density of their community networks, all of that, and you have a certain adaptive capacity. And when all those things start breaking down, that's when this now requires an emergency state response, because all those adaptive measures are gone.
So that must be super complex to quantify, right? As a scale, because it's essentially abstract things that you need to quantify.
But also in a country like India, wouldn't it be really tricky to get that kind of data, especially accurate data on deaths, and how do you, isolate the deaths which are related to heat itself? Because a lot of them are not even reported. And
no, it's deaths at large. It's all deaths, right? So you take all deaths and try and isolate the heat effect by correlating against the temperature and saying, okay, there is a spike in deaths, and so therefore we know that that spike is probably due to heat.
Because we had a similar question during COVID, right? That you would say, would you say somebody died of a heart attack? Would you classify it as a COVID death or not, right? So it's a similar thing, I would say.
With death data, you're right. I mean, there is a big problem with categorizing heat deaths because it presents as different things, right? It presents as multi-organ failure. It presents as a whole bunch of different. So on the death certificate, it's not going to say this is a heat-related death. So that's why you have to rely on these all-cause mortality studies to isolate the signal of heat in the excess deaths on any given day, right? So your heart attack and so on will be sort of couched in the baseline. So the number of heart attacks won't vary dramatically, or will vary within a certain range. But then you get a sudden huge spike, and the only thing that's really changed is the heat. And then you have another day where you see the same spike for another super hot day. And then the third day you see the same spike. And then you start knowing, okay, so this is how many people more are dying because of a 1 degree increase in heat. And that's how you get it.
So, okay, we talked about, heat and heat waves being such a contextual understanding. It's not just a temperature reaching above a certain threshold. So I'm assuming to counter that, to have any sort of, preventive measures against it would also need to be as contextual, and it would be as complex a process, right, as just categorizing something as heat wave. So how do you go about doing that? Like your paper is all about a heat action plan. Probably, I think it's your favorite word in the dictionary. So what is a heat action plan, and how does one go about doing any sort of action against something which is so contextual, so varied?
Yeah, I think the day heat action plans end up in the dictionary is the day we know we're in big trouble. So I hope this is a term of art used by media and policy people and people outside. Well, they should know it. They should know it, but not enough that it's like Oxford's word of the year. So when a heat wave is declared, these are guidance documents that governments develop at a local level. So say at the city level or at the district level, and they'll try and determine what the temperature threshold is for the heat wave, like we just discussed, and then a set of measures to prevent the loss of life. So they'll have an information dissemination system where they'll declare a heat wave and tell people this is a heat wave, this is the color of alert, so it's a yellow alert, red alert, whatever. And this is, very similar to what we've seen with, say, cyclone warnings and flood warnings in some basins in India.
Yeah.
And it'll encourage people to take a set of precautionary measures that allow them to save their lives. But heat action plans are also more than that, because they also talk about long-term measures to reduce the heat effect in a particular place, right? So these are measures that will take many years to implement sometimes. That takes time to do because there's land planning and investment and all of that. If you want to build trees, and trees are really some of the best ways to decrease the temperature. And I think anybody who moves from a city to a very shaded park area nearby, there's a park on the side of the street or a forest, and you'll immediately feel the decrease in temperature.
100%. Yeah.
But that takes 20 years sometimes to do, right? So there's a bunch of long-term measures. If you want to change, like we were talking about earlier, change the nature of your buildings.
Housing,
that requires a policy intervention, that requires some sort of subsidies, that require training of architects, that require a whole bunch of things, and all those things take
also
time.
That would require going through so much of bureaucracy and like a plan to just get through all of that, what clearances need to be taken. So it's
and it's also, it's not just that, it's also a change in mindsets and a shift in what's acceptable, a shift in aesthetics. All of those things have to change.
Also holistic planning, right? It would require holistic planning where a lot of different parties kind of come together and decide that this is how the city would need to be planned. Because right now, you're from Delhi, so and in Noida especially, like construction is everywhere. And I think construction and construction dust also adds to the heat, I'm assuming. And it's very unplanned, it's very haphazard. So it seems like a very kind of unimaginable goal to have that kind of planning.
It almost feels like everything that we are building is sort of adding to our destruction. However dark it may sound, like construction is adding to all of this. All of these automobile proliferation will at the end add to the heat. So It's a very doomsday kind of a picture.
I think there's a legitimate push for better lifestyles, and better buildings, better cooling, better cars, and all of that. All of this has an effect on the climate system, right? I think it's almost zero sum in terms of, you do something that's carbon intensive, it changes the atmosphere, and that then leads to a bunch of impacts, and there's a feedback loop.
Yeah.
That much we know for sure. There's consensus in the policy world that it is not unimaginable to have a sustainable, sort of climate resilient lifestyle and society in future. I think there's been convergence on this question.
Would you say that these things are currently at just a policy level and not infiltrated on an institutional level? Because you said that there is great convergence on a policy level, but I would assume that's on a very academic level, right?
No.
Has it trickled down to the
I said-
institutions? That's what I'm asking. Not
Oh, yeah. There's convergence in the policy research about it.
But I also feel like there is a down up thing also happening where like regular people, when they
hope
get
it
more
does.
aware, when they want to take action, they also can hold these institutions accountable. So I feel like it happens from both sides a little by little,
Yeah,
slowly.
yeah.
So it's not just necessarily top down.
It's not entirely top down, right? I think there is a top down element of like setting the imagination, what is a good solution, what's a good idea, what works. But then accountability is hugely important, right? Transparency is hugely important. The media is hugely important. These are all the things that make the public machinery function better. And I mean, at the core of it is also public engagement with the issue, which I think with heat, what you were suggesting earlier, has increased quite a bit. I think like, there's so much interest in it. Every major paper, every major publication across the world seems to be covering this as like front and center in the climate landscape.
Also the fact that we have climate change sections in our newspapers now, in our
and climate reporters.
Yeah.
Which is a new thing.
Yeah.
Somebody was just covering the climate news.
I think this podcast is also an exercise in that. Like, we wanted to talk about heat and all simply because usually when we talk about heat and especially heat waves in India, it's on a personal level कि तुम क्या कर सकते हो. Like Anushka was telling me while we were developing this episode कि हमेशा बात करते हैं कि पानी पिया करो, stay hydrated, stay indoors. But going ahead one step further, what is something that can be done on a policy level, on a greater level, which, as you said, can change things 15-20 years down the line? Because that's what the plan should be. Because right now we are dealing with things that happened 20 years ago, or at least the things that started happening 20 years ago. So what changes can we make right now that will show effects in 20 years? Interesting.
So I actually, that kind of reminds me, I wanted to ask also, we constantly hear about this 1.5 degree Celsius threshold that Earth is likely to cross soon. So what does that kind of mean? What does that mean for the population?
Current average temperature rise from pre-industrial levels, right? So that's the peg in climate policy. That's the peg everyone uses because that's before fossil fuels were being burnt in a big way, before the industrial revolution and large-scale rise of fossil fuel-based manufacturing. Our average temperature has now increased 1.1 degrees from that level. What is the 1.5? So I'm guessing you're talking about the news report on the WMO suggesting that we will breach 1.5 degrees that came out last week.
Yeah.
So what that is the WMO does climate modeling for a 5-year period. So they've done it for 2023 to 27. And what they found is that it is more likely than not that we will breach 1.5 degrees of warming from the pre-industrial average for at least one of the next 5 years. However, it's very important to note that this 1.5 threshold that they are suggesting is temporary, and it's based on a set of climatological factors such as the El Nino effect and all of that. It doesn't suggest a long-term average breach of the 1.5, which is what the Paris Agreement is based on. So it has to be a long-term average increase of 1.5. We're still closer to 1.1 than 1.5 on that front. But it's psychologically important that in extreme climate conditions, you will get extreme rises in increases in heat and all these other effects, such as more heat waves and so on.
Yeah. So it'll at least shift our thinking from the climate is changing Like the climate will change and climate changed, say, leke, it
Has
has
changed.
changed and it has been changing. So, yeah.
And just kind of circling back to the heat action plan. So you co-authored a report which was published by the Center for Policy Research India, and you reviewed 37 heat action plans across India, right? So let's just get into the heat action plans that you have reviewed, the things that you have found through through the process. First of all, how did you go about doing it? What was the process like? How did you get access to a lot of these documents and the plans and so forth?
The first thing was actually to build a database of heat action plans, because there's no central repository, right? Heat action planning happens at a hyper decentralized level. So different cities, districts, states will have their own versions of it. And all of this is ideally supposed to respond very much to local context, right? It's supposed to respond to who's most vulnerable, what sort of heat they have. We were discussing temperature thresholds and mortality. So what sort of mortality numbers they've had historically, and all of those things. And then we had to get in touch with state disaster management authorities and health departments and so on in different states. So we had to go to I think we went to nearly all the states. And then we analyzed them for all the things we talked about, right? Do they set local temperature thresholds? Do they talk about humid heat or warm nights and all the other things that matter beyond just the absolute dry temperature? Do they have vulnerability assessments where they actually look at their city or their town and figure that the most vulnerable people to heat are here, in the sense that these are the people who are most exposed, for example, such as migrant construction workers or gig workers who are on their motorbikes all day, or traffic cops, or people who are inherently vulnerable because of how their bodies are, so elderly people, pregnant women.
Yeah.
And then we also try to understand what sort of solutions they're proposing, and we talked about some of them, long term, short term, what kind of things do they bake into it. And then we finally built a set of indicators around how implementable these are, right? So are they financed? Do they have some sort of legal backing? What kind of review mechanisms do they have? What kind of learning mechanisms? Because heat action plans are supposed to be updated constantly. It's not like you have one plan and use it for 10 years, because all these parameters are changing. Migrant populations might move from one neighbor to another. One neighborhood might get gentrified and other neighborhoods might fall back on harder times. So you have to map all of these things constantly. And also you're getting new data about the solutions you implement, right? What I'm painting is a picture of a pretty complex document. The solutions in the middle that I talked about are across pretty much every department.
Yeah.
Right? So it's water, sanitation, urban development, housing, public health. All of these departments have to coordinate in the implementation of a heat action plan.
So, talking about this, I was going through your paper, and the kind of solutions that I saw, they were things that you don't necessarily associate with something as extreme as a heat wave, like changing how your weddings happen.
Yeah.
So, there were recommendations like don't have weddings in the day, which is something as basic, but you don't expect something like that to be in a document like that, right? Or ensure that there is power supply, because we know that power cuts and all is a problem in across all urban cities. So ensuring that at least in those months there are no power cuts in those hours.
So the weddings and school timings, and these are two big common behavioral tweaks that the state tries to enforce. A lot of it is left to personal adaptation, but then the government will come in and say these are some of the behavioral changes you need to make in your live like day to day routine. But the most important one and the hardest to implement is probably having a moratorium on work during extreme heat hours, so between 12 and 4, 12 and 5, because that is a direct confrontation between the people who are working, so labor, and the people who own the capital and are building buildings and building, so this is a direct confrontation. So you need to create systems and institutions that allow for those differences to be papered over.
So your paper was essentially like a comparison between all of these heat action plans, right? So looking at the problem definitions, the solutions that was applied, and all the other factors. is there a particular document that you found which was a good document, essentially, which was something that
Or like a
fared
heat action plan that really seemed to work well.
yeah, which fared well in all the departments अच्छे से. What would you, if there was like a award season as an Oscar of heat action plans, I'm sure you would have had that in your mind. What would be, who would have the best heat action plan
No.
trophy?
So this is actually a good moment to make a plug for localization of heat action plans, right? Because we went in very much with the mindset that we cannot and should not be passing judgment on a heat action plan, because the whole mantra of this thing is that it has to be built around the local effects, the local population structures, the availability of resources, so on and so forth, right? A good heat
Makes
action
sense,
plan is a strategic heat action plan where somebody sat through and thought through, this is what I have at my disposal, this is the problem, these are my constraints, this is what I can do. So if that's a one-page document that is super bare bones, that's fine, right? But what we try to do is try and make sure that a certain set of bare bones necessities of doing the vulnerability assessment, of making sure you have some level of financing, those things were checked, right? But there were some that had good elements to them, right? So, for example, the Bhubaneswar heat action plan, I think the Rajkot heat action plan had vulnerability assessments. So they actually went neighborhood to neighborhood and looked at the things that you were talking about. So, do they have access to electricity? Do they have access to water? What is their per capita income? Which means, can they take a day off work when it's super hot and they're feeling heat stress, right? So you test all of these things, go ward by ward, and they had a map where they said, these are the 4 wards where the people are the most vulnerable, have the least adaptive capacity. So direct all your resources there, or most of your resources there. And it introduces a huge new efficiency, because now you can, 20% of your geographic area is going to give 80% of your resilience, right? And probably 80% of your life saved, which means it's much, much, much easier to implement. Now it's gone from a city plan to being a 4-ward implementation plan with city-wide effects.
And then those wards might also have their very hyper-local things that can be accommodated, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you're scrutinizing these wards a little bit more, you'll get a different flavor of what the heat vulnerabilities are and how to deal with them, say street to street, or sometimes even household to household, right? I mean, that's in our imagination, that's how far you could go with having like really specific heat responses. Which comes back to this idea of like testing the temperature in all sorts of different places, because literally it changes based on like what your roof is, where your window is, this and the other, right? Heat action plans are generally unfunded, so only 2 of them explicitly stated where they could get their funding from, but they were quite creative about it, right? So they were saying, okay, there's finance commission, so they have a little bit of money. There are all of these state schemes that we can draw on. So it's 2 or 3 of them that made those linkages.
I would assume that some allocation might be, made from the state government or the central government. Is that not a thing for heat action plans?
No, so we didn't find instances of dedicated funding for heat action plans in any of the 37. So it's not like they came with, okay, here's 100 crores for 5 years and now implement all of these changes. It completely changed the complexion of this, right? If you're changing your built environment, changing your streets, changing how you plant trees and all of those things, and you had an allocation, then there's a much higher chance that it get implemented. It's not a guarantee, but there's a much higher chance. Here, most often, in 8 of the 37 plans, we found that they were implementing line departments to source funding from their existing budgets.
Okay.
Which is a tricky thing, because a lot of governments and a lot of departments don't have the money they need to implement what they need to implement, right? This is a constant problem in local government across the country. Some states are better off than others. But now you add this completely new multi-sectoral policy problem like heat into the mix. And here's a heat action plan, which, by the way, most of them didn't have any legal foundation. So it's not like they were notified under a law.
So wait, what do you mean they didn't have a legal foundation? Matlab, it wasn't enforceable?
Yeah, so a lot of times a policy or a plan will be notified under a law. So a law establishes what the government is supposed to be doing. And then you have a policy or a plan that is giving effect to the objectives of the law. And that becomes enforceable also because it is the law of the land.
And if you don't do it, you're essentially in violation of the law.
Exactly. But a lot of climate policy also operates outside, and a lot of policy in India and across the world operates outside the ambit of law, right? It is just within the executive branch of government, and how the executive branch of government is operationalizing their policy objectives. So in this case, it's heat. EVs, for example, a lot of times don't come under laws, so there's a variety of different policy approaches that are followed.
And you're saying a huge chunk of these heat action plans don't have a legal foundation.
Yeah, we didn't find any. I think there were two after our study, one or two after our study that we heard had made the effort to notify themselves under the Disaster Management Act. That's one thing that was universally missing. Finance is one thing. Some heat action plans made an effort to do, but that's still a very early stage conversation. We need to figure out financing for heat action plans. It is a complex policy problem. Doing vulnerability assessments, figuring out temperature thresholds, getting the mortality data, all of them did differently. So on the mortality data fronts, a couple of them actually established reporting mechanisms for local hospitals, primary healthcare centers, etc., asking them to send upwards to the state capital mortality and morbidity data for heat. So they're trying to establish this kind of backbone of data reporting. So it's happening in different places, different levels. So there were good elements from all of this. And I think the question is, can you get all heat action plans to have these good elements baked into them? Because not all of them have it, right? So can we get all of them to be thinking about these things and then localize the measures, localize your response?
And also, I mean, heat action plans are fairly new in India, right? Like you said, like a decade old or so. So, have there been heat action plans in other parts of the world which may have, acted as inspirations, or where we have seen the effects of it? What works? I mean, of course, like you mentioned, we've been talking about it. It's very contextualized. Like it depends on the context a lot, but. What is it like in other parts of the world? Has it been implemented successfully?
So here are a couple of common trends, right? Financing is a problem across the heat planning universe. I mean, a lot of heat action plans, very few of them actually have significant dedicated resources. And generally, we found that in a few places where there have been significant heat deaths and there's been a major heat wave death event, they're more likely to build out a little bit of financing, especially for the public healthcare side. May or may not do it for all the other long-term measures, but at least for public health, ambulance capacity, making sure there are cooling centers and stuff, there'll be emergency allocations. But in general, finance is a problem. Most of these heat action plans are also soft in the sense that they don't have a hard legal foundation. They're not notified under law.
Even internationally.
Internationally, yeah. So this is a global question, and some in Europe and other places have made the effort of doing that. The third element of this is, in terms of institutional structures, a lot of countries, by lot I mean 8, I think at current count, have this institutional innovation of a chief heat officer that's supposed to actually coordinate all of this.
Sounds like a pretty cool designation, chief heat officer.
Yeah, I think Brazil has a heat officer. I remember reading about this at some point.
I think at present there are 8 countries, and I think all of them are women, which is very, very interesting. And probably lends a very, very different approach to vulnerability and understanding vulnerability and so on. So some of the things I think globally we can learn from. And of course, a lot of them do vulnerability assessments at very high degrees of sophistication, figuring out exactly where the most vulnerable people are and so on. So yeah.
We talked about the different heat action plans you went through as part of your study. We talked about international heat action plans. I want to bring it back home and talk about Delhi. What is the situation with Delhi? Because according to a study done at the University of Cambridge, the entire city is under the danger mark when it comes to heat, right?
In more ways than one, but also heat being one of them. Yeah.
But Delhi doesn't seem to have a heat action plan. Greenpeace has written a letter to Arvind Kejriwal about
Mm.
क्या चल रहा है भाई? So a capital city like Delhi, which is the bedrock of heat waves, I think, and especially for us as media people, it is a problem that we cover almost on a daily basis. Like we see every day there are reports of heat wave alerts and people going through all of these problems in Delhi. But why do you think there is such big a gap where the capital city of a country like India, which has historically gone through such a huge problem of heat, doesn't have a plan in action?
Yeah. I don't have a Delhi specific answer for you. This is something that when we started the heat work, actually, we wanted to start by testing the implementation of Delhi heat action plan, and we'd heard that it existed. And so this is a couple of years ago. So we
Okay.
went around looking for it, and then we found that there wasn't a heat action plan. We talked to people in government, and we found out there wasn't a heat action plan. We know that they have been thinking about it, and it's been in the works for a while, and there have been drafts that have been passed around
Yeah.
and so on, but I don't actually know why it's not been released. At some point, I think they were thinking about releasing it with Delhi's climate plan, which has not come out. So it's an open question, and I guess it's something that obviously, as you say, needs to be done very quickly, very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And if we can have one now, has the heat, that's great. I mean, and definitely before next summer, it has to, I think, be out.
Yeah.
But I want to point to a larger thing. I think Delhi, it's justifiably getting attention, but we don't know if heat action plans exist in a lot of other cities. So of all the metros, how many of them actually have heat action plans? So in our study, after looking around, we didn't have Mumbai didn't have a heat action plan. Chennai didn't have one. Kolkata didn't have one. Delhi doesn't have one for sure. And there's a bunch of very hot places: Jodhpur, Jaipur, Rajasthan. Bunch of places.
They didn't have any, like not even at a local level.
No.
So when you say Delhi doesn't have, or Jodhpur or Bombay doesn't have a heat action plan, it's like there is no plan
that
in
we were
general.
able to access. Let me put it that way, right? So we don't know what exists because we had, like I said, we were building the first repository of heat action plans in the country. And this is based on just like going to people and putting things together. Jodhpur now has a heat action plan, and a very good one in the sense that it has a very good vulnerability assessment. So it has like a very detailed methodology on that. But the problem here is we're in a policy space where the problem is amplifying and ramping up so fast that you don't have the traditional timelines that it would take to have a policy spread, right? Now you have the WMO coming out and saying 1.5 degrees. 10 years ago, it would have been kind of inconceivable to think that we'd breach it in 2022 to 2027 for at least 1 year, more likely than not. Right? So suddenly we're faced with this new reality. And like we were talking about earlier, climate change is here, dangerous climate change is here. And so now we need a huge collective response. So the traditional timelines and steady state rhythms of policymaking need to be amplified very quickly. That's the reason we have coverage problems.
Okay, interesting. So we are going to close in a bit, and I just want to ask. We've discussed so much about heat, and definitely it's a very hot topic, pun not intended.
Or intended.
But what can people like me and Anushka do about it at the end? And this goes to a more deeper existential question: that will something like heat or climate change ever be an electoral issue? Because as we were talking about putting pressure and implementation bottom up, I mean, what can the people in the bottom of the chain do?
Yeah, I think if your first question was in reference to the media, obviously there's a huge amount that the media can do, right? In deepening heat coverage and trying to get to places that we don't talk about now. So you'll get a lot of coverage in Mumbai, you won't get a a lot of coverage on because these are traditional gaps in media coverage. It's not heat specific, it's in general. But the thing is, heat is one of those things that has very different effects for different people, right? So some of the more rural reporting around agriculture effects, how it's affecting farmers' incomes and so on is actually very interesting. I mean, there are stories out there that talk about this. So just to keep covering it and also, build the heat action plans more into the coverage, which is what do the heat action plans say, what was supposed to be done, what is being done, what is not being done, right? These questions of basic accountability implementation are very important. The next phase of our own research is actually about testing whether these things are being implemented at all, right? So this is just the first cut. The next phase of our research is actually trying to understand whether implementation is happening. And we suspect there's a wide degree of variation between states and districts and so on. Some probably implemented better than others. In terms of electoral concerns and what the broad popular perception of climate change is and of heat is, at the moment, it's not really front and center, and we know that climate change is not operating at the same political level it's operating at in, say, in Australia or the US or the UK, where it's actually something that's swinging national elections. We've entered a phase where it can swing national elections of major democracies. We are not there yet. The way climate change will probably operate is through second order effects.
Yeah.
So it'll operate through changes in agricultural markets, changes in inflation, settlement patterns because of migration and so on.
Migration. And then the
droughts.
whole people cost related to that, right?
Exactly. So it'll operate in those second order effects. So climate change will be a forcer of electoral change probably, but it'll operate from behind the scenes because there isn't a lot of cognitive tagging of climate change being the problem, we need to solve it.
Yeah.
Then I think you'll start seeing heat action plan implementation be more electorally salient. So you'll have like this patchwork of areas of the climate policy universe that are electorally salient. And then you'll have a bunch of things that are too technocratic and people don't really care about. But I have a feeling in India, it's going to be more focused on adaptation and impacts and resilience rather than on decarbonization. Because decarbonization is almost a luxury to a lot of people, right? Like they don't have real choices of like, do I choose an EV versus a internal combustion engine? It's about, I will use anything, including a second, third hand scooter to get my kids to school on time and then get to work, right? So it's about graduating from a cycle to a scooter. It's not really about graduating from a car to an internal combustion car to an electric vehicle. So it'll probably all be on the impacts and resilience side.
Sometimes I just feel like whenever somebody comes around my locality to do their party campaigning and all, just get them inside and be like, what are you doing for climate change? how will you ensure net zero in this mohalla?
No, but that's actually, it's a good point, right? So in some of my previous work, I interacted a little bit more with MLAs and local, grassroots politicians. And even there, I think there's like a universal acknowledgement that stuff is happening, but an actual understanding of what climate change is and what the localized impacts are going to be is not there. Right? So if you ask them, what do you think your constituency is going to look like in 50 years? Sadly, the most common response I get is, it's well beyond my time. And I got a very frank answer from one MLA who is now a pretty prominent politician in that state, who said, it's beyond my time. Everything happens on a 5-year cycle. I am elected to deliver things on a 5-year cycle. If you're expecting me to make political moves that incur benefits well beyond the time I'm in active politics at the cost of things that actually are about the next election, then that's not really a good use of my time or resources. So it's about these...
And it won't be in their best interest to think about...
Yeah. And this is the problem with adaptation, right? Any adaptation, heat, flooding, coastal rise, all of these things.
Yeah.
There's a huge political incentive problem at the heart of it, which is if you do it, you're forestalling impacts that might be felt only many years later.
Yeah.
a lot of times these are invisible things that actually have no direct benefit. So a heat action plan is not building you a spanking new highway or a brand new dam.
Exactly. रिबन काटने का कोई प्रोग्राम नहीं हो रहा ना उसमें.
And also these things like building roads and stuff are still, even in the voters' minds, are a big, parameter of a successful government. Because
Yeah.
even apart from heat action, when we ask people, okay, why do you prefer this party or this government or whatever, a big answer is, oh, they built a lot of roads or highways.
Yeah.
Something this is tangible, yeah.
Yeah.
And like with air pollution, so interesting to see this conversation about smog towers, right? Which
may not be the best, yeah.
I think a lot of experts seem to think may not be fully effective. But this is now, the thing that has attracted the most attention, captured the most policymakers' imaginations. The benefits will only come 10, 15 years down the line, 5 years down the line. So it may be well after the political cycle. But the second problem is, what are the benefits? The benefits are nothing happened. Like you've won when nothing has happened.
Yeah.
So then so you made the investment, nothing has happened. What is the political gain?
Also, it must also be well beyond the voters' time also, na?
But also on a slightly optimistic note also, I think the younger generation of voters will be coming up. There is at least hope that they would care more about climate change as being like a, important mudda. Because I did a couple of stories with a lot of these young climate activists, and it's quite refreshing to see. I mean, maybe it's their age, but it's refreshing to see how passionate they are and how much they, want to take action, and not just in little things, but also big things like reaching out to their local ministers, reaching out to people who actually have the authority to make differences and hold them accountable. So possibly, hopefully, it will become an electoral thing too.
So we have statistics actually on what global warming awareness and beliefs are. This is brand new because it's 2022 statistics. It's a survey that tried to understand how climate change is perceived, and it's called Climate Change and the Indian Mind. And here's, I think, what gives us a little bit of pause, right? So they say that 54% of people in India say they know either just a little about global warming or have never heard of it, while only 9% they say they know a lot. Their study also seems to indicate that awareness and concern about climate change is very much fragmented along socioeconomic lines. So the people who are most concerned are rich people with high levels of access to information, and that dramatically drops as you go further down the socioeconomic ladder. But as we've talked about, it's the people who are most likely to be affected by heat or coastal erosion or flooding. These are the people who are the most the least likely to understand why it's happening to them and all of that. But interestingly, and here's the other side of it, right? Here's the counterpoint. 74% say that they have experienced the effect of global warming, and that's a plus 24% increase since 2011. So more people are feeling it, not enough people know about it, and those that know about it and care about it are the people who have the most money to protect themselves without state intervention.
And the people who are feeling it, they might not be able to connect it with something like climate change, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So you're feeling ki garmi pad rahi hai, but you're not necessarily able to connect this to a grander phenomenon.
Yeah, there is also data on that, which is 57% think that global warming is caused mostly by human activities, and 31% think it's caused mostly by natural changes in the environment. So it seems more people than not think that it is because of stuff that we are doing. But whether it's connected to climate change and climate change policy is therefore getting more attention, I highly doubt it. Before the 2019 election, both the BJP's and Congress's election manifestos were studied for their mentions of climate change. And I think it was like less than 1% of the text had to do with climate related issues on both parties. So that's the indicator, right? So that's the smoking gun.
Well, there goes my optimism.
Anoushka was like, on an optimistic note, 1% mention.
But I think Before we wind up, I just want to ask to the people who are listening to this podcast. So I have two questions. One is, if you had one thing to tell people who are listening to this podcast, what would it be? And also, if there are three influential people who can make a change who are listening to this podcast, which is unlikely, but hypothetically, if they are, who do you hope it is, and what is it that you would want to tell them?
Imagine that they are listening to it and they heard it and they have the power to do it like that. So who would those people be? And first, if the general listener is listening to us, what would you want them? What is the one thing that you would want them to do?
That's a tough one. That's a really tough one. I would say, something that's benefited me a lot, I would say just sort of keep your eyes open, read a little bit about what's going on, and try and connect that to your innate sense of human empathy, which is try and think about what people are going through because of this. It's not easy to do, but ultimately, the only way we're going to get out of this whole climate change thing is if we discover ways of being empathetic and having some level of solidarity with the people around us, right? I think we need to think about human suffering a little bit more. In terms of three influential people, I would say the MLA, to me, is a very important cog in the machinery of Indian public administration, and also in making sure there's some level of climate justice. I would really hope that they sort of try and grapple with what heat means for them and their jurisdiction. The finance managers of various governments, has to be finance. This is really, really, really key. And finally, I would probably say, if there are researchers listening, climate researchers, policy researchers, I think there's so much more work that needs to be done on climate policy. So these are probably the three people, and including, and because podcasts, I think, are listened to more by younger audience groups. If any of these people are in the making in your audience pool at the moment,
So if you're studying to be a
finance manager or are in local student politics or are currently doing a master's and thinking about what they want to do in life, should I do a PhD? Should I not do a PhD? Those folks, right? So this is really the agenda of the future. So those, I think, be the three people.
So if you guys are listening and you are amongst these people, please, or if you know somebody who's a MLA or something, share it with them and उनको बोलो करो यार कुछ. तुम्हारा नाम शायद ना आए, but
yeah,
करो. Please do something about it.
The way MLAs work, right? So they work so hard. I shadowed a few MLAs. It's incredible. You wake up early in the morning and it's go, it's like somebody's funeral. It's like a party meeting. And then you finish at 12 at night. There is no time to digest a 35-page report from the Center for Policy Research. So just go in one of those shadis, just go up to them and say, have you heard about heat waves?
लिफाफा देते समय सर एक बड़ा अच्छा हुआ. Or also, I would say even more influential than in that case, than an MLA is an MLA's assistant.
Yeah.
So an MLA's assistant should listen to it, make all the notes, PAs बना के एक पेज के document में दो सर को.
Or put it in a speech. Or put it in his speech.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Aditya. This was a very lovely conversation. But also, we were talking about heat waves and heat so much, but it was always on the back of my mind also, because for the last 2 hours, all the fans and ACs in my room has been off. So we've been feeling it firsthand, just how, bad it is. But quite an ordeal to get through.
Yeah, both of you must be really baking. Please turn your ACs on, and thank you for enduring this for 2 hours. So it's a pleasure being on.
No, thank you so much.
Nice.
Thank
you, Aditya.
Thank you so much.
It was a great chat. And Anoushka, how was it? How first thoughts? Batao.
I am sweating.
Yeah.
Not from anxiety of listening to Aditya, but just having the fans and AC off in my room for the last 2 hours.
Our listeners, अगर तुम्हें बीच में इस conversation के कुछ ऐसा buzzing sound सुनाई दे तो हम लोग पंखा ऑन कर चुके हैं. we don't care about the audio quality इतना because we are sweating literally. Yes. So Anushka, कैसी लगी ये बातचीत?
Very enlightening.
गर्मा गर्म चर्चा. Yes.
Oh my god, you have to stop.
Dude, I really liked his watch यार. मतलब his watch really मतलब काफी मेरे को बढ़िया लगी यार.
But I feel like I would just get very paranoid if I had something like that. Like I would just keep checking throughout the day like he does. Yeah. क्योंकि ये oximeter के साथ भी मेरे साथ हुआ था. COVID के time पे when I got the oximeter, I would keep checking my oxygen levels.
पूरे दिन लगा के देखे. So glad you mentioned COVID because even in our discussion, he drew a lot of parallels to COVID. And I really found that so interesting because in a way, the whole problem of COVID, while it was very, focused and it happened over 2 years and, उससे पहले नहीं था, उससे बाद में नहीं था. Heat feels something similar, right? Because the cause of the problem is so vast, it has so many more variables than a normal just एक चीज की वजह से हुआ. Then the people it's affecting is so again that's so differential. मतलब it's not affecting everybody equally, just as we were talking about during COVID. And then similarly the kinds of plans and the kinds of mitigation tactics that we had for COVID, heat waves के scene में भी मेरे को काफी similarity दिख रही है where it's not a one size fits all solution. It has to be hyper local. His biggest critique actually of all the heat action plans was that there was a lack of definition of vulnerable groups and it being a very hyper localized model, जो कि सेम चीज मेरे को याद है हम लोग कोविड के टाइम पे बात कर रहे थे.
But don't you think it's interesting that COVID, even though it was like a very new virus to us, within like say 2 years, we were able to quite effectively isolate who the vulnerable groups are, how we can deal with it. We got like vaccines for it. Like there was a lot of action that happened really quickly. But with heat, I feel like, or just climate change in general has been an issue for, I feel like, a long time and people have been talking about it. But but like he said, there's so many caveats to coming up with a solution. And also the kind of motivation to find a solution, because I really liked how he talked about unless there's like a tangible result, something to show for your success, neither politicians, our leaders, nor the voters, people who are to hold them accountable, really, consider it a success unless there's something to show for it, right?
Yeah, I really like that MLA wala, not MLA, but that politician wala story where he's like, mere time mein nahi hone wala, so why would I care? Which is such a...
Yeah, and that's a real thing, yeah. And also, I mean, towards the beginning of the episode, we talked about how urban infrastructure really plays a role in heat waves. But I didn't realize it was this bad. Like, I didn't realize to what extent and how each decision and the kind of material you use, where you build, what you build around it, like so,
exactly.
Like all of it contributes to the heat wave. It's crazy.
Yes, 100%. Even like the CPR research ka critique wasn't like it didn't single out a particular problem. So it talked about the short-term solutions, the medium-term single season ke throughout ke solutions, and then the long-term solutions, which really goes to show the vastness of this problem, right? So everything from making sure that there is electricity supply during those hours to in the long term changing how your automobile system works and all of that. Everything is a solution to heat waves.
Yeah, and also changing working hours.
Changing work is तो पूरा मतलब paradigm shift हो जाएगा यार.
Yeah. But there are, he also mentioned some, like, all of this sounds quite like huge, like quite a distant dream kind of a thing, but he also mentioned some really small things that you can do on a personal level that you don't necessarily think of, like what time you have your weddings, or like I mean, this is also administrative, but like what time the school timings of kids and things like that, which at least on a smaller level can help.
And these are things which are doable.
Yeah, exactly.
I can see it happening कि एक school decide करता है कि because of heat waves we'll have our school time during the night.
Maybe not night, but like evening.
Would you rather have the school during the evening or the night? I would say night यार, because anyway हम लोग रात को ही पढ़ते थे और ये सब रात को ही करते थे, तो अच्छा स्कूल में भी रात को ही पढ़ लो.
छोटे बच्चों के लिए थोड़ा सा tricky हो जाएगा. But yeah, I mean, I get your point. Yeah.
But still यार थोड़ा मतलब एकदम peak time and especially this is again like a personal thing जो when he was talking about school timings and all this, मेरे अंदर से बात आ रही थी कि कुछ करो ना करो एक चीज तो कर सकते हो कि PT पीरियड मत रखो यार गर्मियों में. Because I remember जब हम स्कूल में होते थे, there used to be our PT period and obviously we are kids, हमें खेलने का मन तो करता ही था, तो as soon as some football would be thrown, we would all start running, but after that we would just die inside. And I can only imagine what would happen to the kids right now. So it's pretty like for school children and like the people who are working outside.
And even apart from like playtime, we had those mandatory PT, remember, where they would make us do like kasrat standing outside in the sun. It was crazy.
Oh, like... yes. Assembly. Oh, man.
So, yeah,
this assembly, though, you've touched on a nerve.
let's swerve back before you go down trauma trail.
Very interesting you mentioned this, because towards the end we asked him, right, if there are a few people who would listen, influential people who you would want to send this podcast to. I think a lot of them could be school principals and school administrators and office administrators, right? Because something like this, while we had discussed at length कि बड़े level पे change लाने में तो बहुत time लगेगा. There's so much bureaucracy, so many different ministries and departments will have to work in tandem. But छोटे-छोटे pockets में, छोटे-छोटे apartments में, छोटे-छोटे housing societies में ये change लाना, I think it will be easier. So I think I would want to direct this episode to people like that. मतलब जो Residents Welfare Association के presidents हैं, उनको भेजो ये कि भाई तुम अपने apartments में cool roof implement कर लो, या किसी स्कूल के प्रिंसिपल या ट्रस्टी को बोलो कि okay, tweak your timings and incorporate heat as a part of your daily thinking, at least during the heat seasons, right?
And like do heat wave planning in their own like little capacities, right?
Yeah.
Like even if not at like a city or a town level, I mean, I think any administration can start thinking of heat action plans as part of their planning in general.
Oh yeah, that'll be so interesting. Ab samjho, because like again, the biggest critique of all of these heat action plans was that it wasn't localized enough, right? What can be more nuanced and local than a heat action plan of a society or the heat action plan of a office building or of a school?
Yeah, and in those cases, like the stakeholders are directly involved also, so it will be a lot more effective that way, no?
Nice, yeah. That would be pretty interesting, because I would be totally down to making like a heat action plan, let's say for our office. And our office building में सोचो अगर ऐसे बन रहा है, it'll be nice.
Yeah, I think the first step is to just get heat action plans in people's consciousness, just the idea of it, and that
True.
This is something that you can think along the lines of, and then from there people can take it in whichever capacity that they can really.
Yeah. Again, drawing a parallel to COVID, when COVID happened, a lot of the apartment houses, a lot of the schools, a lot of the offices had their own COVID guidelines, right? Which was, based on the bigger ICMR guidelines and all of that. But still, they were tweaked and adapted in their own ways. And this also reminds me of a previous Big Story episode that we did about the education system.
Okay.
Even there, our experts talked about how there is a need to give a lot of autonomy to the local bodies and let them decide the exact approach in which education system should be followed. So just because a state level body has decided कि तुम्हें इतने hours लगाने हैं एक lesson पे, it doesn't mean that every school has to abide by that, because some schools में some chapter will get done easier because the kind of children that are there, the kind of demographic is there, it's different. So a lot of these issues, I think, are, while they are specific to their fields, health, education, etc.,
similar approaches can help. Yeah.
जो solution समझ आ रहा है, approach काफी similar लग रही है कि empower the local bodies and have them, support them. Again, another thing that हम लोग हमेशा बात करते हैं, fund them enough, which was also a point that Aditya raised, and then have them deal with the situation at a very local level. So I think that if there can be one takeaway from this episode, I think it should be that, right? One, as you mentioned, getting heat action plan in all of our vocabularies and, start thinking about them in a more policy level. And the other one could be just act local, right?
And just be more conscious, like you said, be more conscious of your choices and how they impact.
And I would even go as far as to say choices, not just in terms of, your choices when it comes to climate. I would even say your everyday choices when it comes to your politics. So the kind of leaders that you're choosing, are they climate conscious? Are they I would definitely want to, in the next election issue, see some candidate who's going to be like, I'll work on climate change. Nahi hone wala hai, no. Kafi wishful thinking, but...
काफी हमने यहाँ पे ज्ञान पेल लिया.
But still, यार, अगर ये होगा तो मजा आ जाएगा. Nice, interesting. और बताओ, Anoushka, what other stories are you working on? What can we see more from the Quint Fit team?
Well, Fit keeps doing a lot of stories on health, mental health, health policy. We do also videos and podcasts similarly. Yeah, just keep an eye out for Fit, and I'm sure you'll see a lot more heat related stories as well. So climate change.
100%. It's not like this problem is getting solved anytime soon. And yes, we shall be in the front, reporting as much as we can, making all of these conversations like heat waves, and we earlier had an episode about microplastics on the big story. So getting all of these issues, which I would say are very niche, like heat waves or a microplastic,
and bringing in experts, people that can really kind of talk about them.
Yes, experts like Anoushka.
Yeah, okay.
I have flattered you enough.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. I love this format and I had a lot of fun, and also very informative. But I have to go and turn on my fan now or I will die.
Yes. Okay, thanks a lot for being with us, Anoushka. Thanks a lot to Aditya again for having this amazing chat with us. And thanks a lot to you guys, our listeners, जो हमें support करते हैं, हमें सुनते हैं. And let us know in the comments if you want to see and hear Anoushka more in the future episodes, because she really likes this podcast.
Please say only good things.
Yes. And yes, this was Prateek.
This was Anoushka.
And we'll see you in the next episode.
Well, you'll probably see Anjali in the next episode. Okay.
Who knows?
Bye.
Chalo, bye. The Big Story is a Quint original podcast, executive produced by Shelly Walia and Ritu Kapoor. This episode was hosted by Prateek Lidhu and Anoushka Rajesh, produced and edited by Prateek Lidhu, and the theme music is from BMG. A special thanks to our guest, Mr. Aditya Pillai. You were listening to the Quint's podcast.